I'd like to welcome you again to our first monthly show of the year 1977 on local history. Tonight I have for my guest Mr. Wayne Paddon. And Wayne, I'd like to thank you very much for giving up your time and coming on the show. Wayne, as you know, is the head of history at Arthur Bowden Secondary School. He's a young man who went to school in St. Thomas, at public school and high school, and university, where he specialized in history. And he has now joined the ranks of local Elgin and St. Thomas historians who published a book. And this is his book, The Story of the Talbot Settlement, 1803 to 1840. And it's a short history of, or a frontier history of Western Ontario. You can get it from the bookstores. Wayne, would you like to say something about the book? When did it first come out?
The book reached actually the stores last December the 11th, George. And it really has been, it was a gratifying thing for me to see the response that it received. It has sold well, and now it's into its second printing, and seems to be going well.
Well, I'm very pleased that it's doing well, and it, of course, is indicative of the fact that St. Thomas people seem to be interested in their early history. And I'd like to congratulate Wayne, because this book is a very fine piece of work, and it has notably in it a large number of source documents. And by source documents, what historians mean are the original documents that describe things, the letters, the orders in council, the acts of parliament, by which Talbot operated his great domain, and by which things developed. And I would highly recommend it as a book for anyone. Want to give it to a present, go and buy it, and you couldn't buy anybody a better present. Now, Wayne, so much for the plug on the book. It is really very good. Now, as you know, Wayne is a history teacher, and he was one of the teachers who pioneered the study of local history in our high schools. And what Wayne and I want to do tonight is a little different from some of the other programs. We're setting this up and hoping that a tape of this program could be used by the elementary schools. You may not know, but the Elgin Board of Education has can take a videotape of this, and then those videotapes can be sent out to various schools, and the teachers can play them on a videotape recorder or player, and then the students can see this program as if just as if they were like you and watching it live. So we talked about Talbot back in September with John Carr, but we're going back again to the early story of the Talbot settlement, and hoping that, not gearing this to a 6 to 14-year-old level, but trying to make it a program that students in a public school could see and might enjoy. Now, Wayne, my wife said I should turn it over to you and just let you go as you wish. How do you want to tackle this?
Well, I think let's do it the way you're saying. Let's not zero in too much on Talbot, but it's pretty difficult to talk about our area without bringing Talbot into it in a considerable way. But let's start with Talbot, and then show how Talbot brought people into the area, and then let's have a look and see how St. Thomas and London and some of the other smaller centers developed. And particularly, let's talk about some of the people, because that's what's really important, and particularly the ordinary pioneer. Oftentimes they're neglected in the writing of history. But one thing I would like to do, and I mentioned this to you before, is to say a few words about those people that lived here hundreds of years before Talbot. And whether the people in the residents in our area know or not, this area was inhabited by a group of Iroquois Indians called the Neutral Indians, who were quite important. They weren't neutral. They existed by trading with the Hurons to the north and with the Iroquois to the south, and eventually they weren't able to maintain this peaceful coexistence, and they disappeared to the Iroquois, who wiped them out when they wiped out the Hurons, and that was the story of Sainte Marie. Now, unfortunately, you don't hear much about the Neutrals, but there were several neutral forts scattered through southwestern Ontario. They had a notable history. and they did have some contact with the Europeans. Now, I believe you were going to say something
Well,
about
yes,
early
I think
contact.
of all the Iroquois tribes, which, remember, include the 5 tribes of the League of the Haudenosaunee, the Senecas, Cayugas, and Onondagas, and the Mohawks, were related to the Hurons, and then the Tobacco Indians who were south of them, and then the Neutral Indians who lived all along the north shore of Lake Erie. And in the contact with the early white men, who were, of course, the French mainly, we know much more about the Hurons and the Tobacco Indians and the Senecas and the Cayugas than we do about the Neutrals, because on the notes I have here, all of our information about the Neutrals depend on 2 visits, one in 1626 by Fathers Dayon and Grenoble and Lavie, and one in 1640 to 41 when Pierre Brebeuf, the martyr of Sainte Marie, and Chaumont came. And it's from their information that the only written record we have. So we know very little about these early Neutrals, and we do know that by 1650 they were exterminated, and any that were left were adopted into the Seneca tribe and intermarried with them. And so most of the information we get about the Neutrals now has to depend on archaeological digs. But there were a couple strange things with them. You made the point that they were neutral between the Huron and the Iroquois. And then they couldn't keep, like neutrals rarely can, they couldn't keep that. And the Iroquois wiped them out after they wiped out the Hurons. But they were a rather ferocious people to the tribes to the west. The few white men who saw them said that they were very, very ferocious in war and killed prisoners differently than the Iroquois did, who usually, well, they killed a lot of prisoners and tortured them, but they usually took them back and adopted them and intermarried. And the most peculiar thing about the Neutrals were that if they saw a herd of deer, they killed every one, because they were afraid if they let one deer escape, it would tell the other deer, and they wouldn't have any more hunting. So much for the Neutrals. That's a long history, or a short history of a long span of time, because I think the history here goes right back to right after the glaciation ceased, and
Yes.
probably around 10,000 years of history that we've talked about in 1 minute. Eh?
But a lot of people have read stories about Indians being here
Yeah.
when Talbot came, and there were Indians.
Yes.
And these are Mississauga, a branch of the Ojibwe Indians, which came down from northern Ontario.
Yeah.
And there are also Iroquois, who had migrated from the United States after the War of Independence. There are Huron settlements in Windsor District, and these people are treated quite carefully and diplomatically by the United Empire Loyalists, people like Colonel Bobby that we'll be talking about later, and some of the other land agents. And as a matter of fact, all of our area from Long Point extending to Windsor, and we'll look at this in a minute on a map I have, was an Indian reserve. Now, maybe we shouldn't call it a reserve.
No, maybe not.
But definitely these are Indian lands which are turned over to the British government and then turned over again to settlers such as Colonel Talbot. So there were Indians.
Yeah.
Talbot himself made friends with the Indians at first. These are not the neutral Indians.
No, they're the people who moved in after. This was just all of southwestern Ontario was really just a vast hunting preserve that
Yes.
had no settled villages in it, and the Iroquois hunting parties would come here, and then, as you say, the Mississaugas and the drifted in, and the some Ojibways and some of the Hurons and so on. Now, where do you want to go after the Indians?
now-
So much for them.
Right. When Colonel Talbot came then, this was, to all intents and purposes, a wilderness.
Right.
There were people here. However, the land had been surveyed, and it was difficult to get. So that although Colonel Talbot wanted to settle at Port Stanley and get several acres and bring people in, he wasn't able to. So he had to take what he could get.
Why couldn't he have Port Stanley?
Well, there was a surveyor, and people have heard of the Bostic Road by the name of John Bostic, and he had connections with the United Empire Loyalists and the land boards of Windsor. And they were able to become absentee landlords and get control over several and much of the good land of Yarmouth and some of Southwold and around Port Stanley. And the map that we have in front of you showing St. Thomas, one of Burwell's first maps, will show Bostic's lot, so we'll come to that.
All right, yeah.
Now, I think what we might do is have a look at the first slide, which shows the extent of the Talbot settlement at the height of Talbot's power.
All right.
And I think from the slide, yeah, can we see the first one now? Keep talking.
No, I think we're having a little problem. We have a remote control here to control the slides, and until we get that slide in, perhaps we could just tell the people, describe orally how big that area was that Talbot controlled.
Yeah, okay. Well, it's pretty well southwestern Ontario, and you're talking about Long Point, which was not exactly part of the Talbot settlement, but land just west of Long Point to a northern boundary of the Thames River in London, and using the Thames as a northern boundary, traveling west toward Detroit, and including what would be Sandwich today, with the exception of what was the old Amherstburg Fort and Fort Malden and across from Detroit. So that was pretty well the extent of the Talbot settlement.
So that's the counties of Essex and Kent and Elgin,
Middlesex,
Norfolk.
right, Middleton,
And-
Houghton,
Yes.
yeah.
That's a tremendous area. Really all along the shore of, in many ways, as far as Long Point, he lived in the same country that the neutral Indians had controlled. Rather interesting,
That would be a
didn't
good,
it? Yeah.
an excellent way of putting it for students, yes.
And we're still having trouble showing those slides.
Well, perhaps we can go, turn?
No, I think they're having trouble with the machine there.
Yeah. Well, how do
No.
I get, just push down here?
Oh, here we are.
Oh, yeah, okay.
All right. Now, you want to say something about that map?
Yeah, the area that's shaded is roughly the Talbot settlement at the extent of Colonel Talbot's power. And we have already described the boundaries. The
Can I just interrupt you there for the audience? That northern line of the shaded, is that the Thames River?
That is the Thames River,
I see.
yes. Called La Tranche by the Indian and by the French-Canadian settlers, the explorers, because it looked like a long trench flowing down toward Lake Simcoe, or
I see.
what is now
Lake St. Clair.
Lake St. Clair, right.
And are there any other points you want to make about that? That there were people in Long Point. That's Long Point on the right-hand end, eh? The start of the point.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, Colonel Talbot, as we said, could not get land at Port Stanley, so he settled for land about 15 to 20 miles west of Port Stanley at a place called Port Talbot. There's Colonel Talbot. This is from a portrait. Now, if we look at the spot below where Colonel Talbot had his cabins, we are looking at roughly that part of the area called Port Talbot, although it doesn't exist as a port, although he was visited by people who did come by ship. During the War of 1812, for example, General Brock stopped, visited with him.
The Talbot Creek just wasn't as navigable, and ships couldn't get in and out of it the way they can in Kettle Creek at Port Stanley. Eh?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Let's have a look at a couple more of these. Again, you're looking back, and this next slide, you're down below and looking up toward the hill. And Talbot would have stood here many times and looked toward the top of the hill, and that is probably where his first cabin was. Here we are standing on the shore of the lake looking back toward the Talbot Creek, and this emphasizes the point you made, that it has silted up because it wasn't ever a particularly good navigable route. Nevertheless, Talbot did require a moving river to have a mill, and we'll look at a map showing where they had that later on. At the top of the hill, looking down, you can see how the creek has flooded at different times of the year, and this no doubt would
Just
have
make a
caused
point there that
difficulty.
the people are looking at that picture. If you were to go up to Port Talbot today and look down the hill, it probably looks exactly the same as it did when Talbot was looking at it, eh? Because you have those high banks all the way to Port Stanley, and they're treed, and you can't see any other houses, just as Talbot wouldn't have been able to see any.
Right. It's very, very much the same
Yeah.
way, and you can get the atmosphere of the time. We're looking back toward Port Stanley, and there was a little fort just at the brow of the hill across the creek.
I've never heard of that. Now, what was that little fort for?
Well, I would imagine in the event of War of 1812, they probably had
Oh, I see.
ammunition stored. And they were always anticipating some kind of war with the United States. It's on the little map that was drawn by Burwell's brother. Now here's at the top of the hill, this is an oil painting, a contemporary oil painting showing the early cabins that Talbot had put up. And at this point, I'd like to switch to...
Can I just say something about that? That's in 1803, the year Talbot settled there. We don't know who made the painting, but it is a painting, and it's called Colonel Talbot's Settlement, and it is a log cabin that he lived in for many years. I hope that our viewers can see that on the top of the hill.
Now, if we can look at this sketch, we have a sketch that was taken from that particular painting, which, as you say, is at the archives. And again, if you could use your imagination, it wouldn't be much different today if you can imagine the cabins being there. And again, you're looking back toward Port Stanley, and this is where Talbot started.
This is a little log cabin here, and that we assume, I wish we knew who'd painted it. It must have been somebody who was there in 1803 who, it's a watercolor, an oil painting.
I think it's an oil painting.
Oil painting,
yes.
yeah. But that's the way it's marked as Talbot, so we have to say that that's the most authentic picture we have of his log cabin.
Right.
Right.
One more slide. This would be, again, the trip up the hill, which Talbot would have taken several times. And now you see the home as it is in 1974. The only addition to it has been a little front porch that the cars have put on. And you, of course, George, have been there many times and know something about the home. Maybe you could just say something about it.
Well, I think, I don't think that house incorporates any of the log cabin, but it does incorporate the earliest house after the log cabin that Talbot built. And he's like most settlers. You start out and you build a log cabin first, and then you get a little money and a little wealthier, and you build a house. It's the same thing that happened all through Elgin County. So that this house is the house as it was readjusted by the Aries. And John Carr, and his father, who own the property now, have kept the house. That's John Carr there, is it? The present...
That's John, and this was one day when local history class was out. John always takes time to tell the students about the home and give a little account of Talbot.
They've been very kind to open it to students. Unfortunately, Mr. Carr Sr. is quite ill now.
I see.
Yes, and you can't get in the house now, the old house. But they have kept the essential character of the house, and I think it's a real landmark in Elgin County to have that.
If you look at the, again, the east end of the home, you can see some of the mid-19th century clapboard style. The windows, there's a story about the windows which I'm not sure of, but this corner of the home would have been the area of the house where Colonel Talbot would have had his sliding window.
Maybe we better explain to our audience
talk about that, yes.
About what that window was for.
Right. Colonel Talbot was not the most lovable person, particularly before noon hour.
No.
And
just like my Uncle Willie, you couldn't talk to him before noon hour.
Yes, anytime after 12 o'clock he'd had a couple of drinks and his disposition brightened up.
Yeah.
But on occasion, the settler would get quite annoyed with Talbot, and they would even come to fisticuffs. So George Crane, who was Colonel Talbot's right-hand man, at least for a while, suggested that he should do something about this, and they put in a sliding glass window pane through which you had to talk to the old boy. He also had 4 or 5 big German shepherds just to sort of back up his argument about not being touched.
So that was where the window, the famous window in the house was.
Now maybe we can say just a word or two about Talbot and the reason why some people would be annoyed with him. Talbot's land program would generally consisted of giving people land whom he thought would do a good job, so that you might come in the morning and ask Talbot for land, and he would turn you down because you weren't wearing the proper clothes. And this actually did happen. In the afternoon, if you could drum up some better clothing and shave and come back, particularly after you had a couple, then he would look you over and say, you're a much better looking fellow than that fellow I talked to this morning, so why not? Now you've got a few obligations. You take over this property, you're going to have to cut down several trees, you're going to have to get 15 acres going within the next few years, you're going to have to get 3 acres within the next 2 years. You're going to have to get out and clean the road up in front of your household, and you're going to have to get a cabin built. And if you don't do this, then I'm going to put you off. And he did. And so there were occasions when people would be quite annoyed with Talbot and come back. Or there would be occasions when people would be quite disappointed after coming hundreds of miles, not getting land, and then they would be pretty hostile.
Yeah. And then in some cases when he just had this map and he wrote the name in pencil on the lot. And if they didn't do their settlement duties, he rubbed them off.
That's exactly right.
But, you know, I think it was exaggerated how many he rubbed off. He was really pretty fair, wasn't he?
If you fulfilled your duties with Talbot, then he fulfilled his obligation to you.
Yes. I think, you know, it's sort of easy to say, well, he was kind of a crook, but he wasn't.
Well, he made sure that people had all kinds of food.
Yeah.
And when going got tough, he made sure there was wool in the settlement so that the wives could weave, and clothing for their children and for the pioneers.
Yeah.
And he was there when they did need him.
Mm-hmm. I thought you might be interested. I just ran across this document which is by Garrett Oakes, and it describes in July 1810. He and Abraham House and Isaac Vale and Jacob Shears all came from Port Ryersea, which is the other side of the Long Point settlement. And they rowed, first they portaged their boat across the Long Point, that big peninsula, and then they rowed along the shore till the mouth of Kettle Creek. And then they walked up here to down at the bottom of the valley there in St. Thomas, the Fingal Road and the London Road. And it's interesting, then they had to make their way. They came from where Port Stanley was. There was nothing there then, to where St. Thomas is, and there were only about 3 settlers there. But this is his account of 1810. We came to the present site of St. Thomas, which was then Captain Rappledge's farm. The captain had 1 acre of land chopped and had erected a snug shanty, and Mr. Vandeville had 1, and Captain Secord had 1. And that was all houses that there were between Long Point and the Talbot settlement.
That's right.
And then they had to get out to where Talbot's place is. And now Colonel Burwell, who you're going to say something about, laid out a road, or was laying it out, but really just the blaze marks were there, or the surveyor's marks. So they wanted to get to Talbot's house, and what they did is one man would go ahead, they found the first survey mark, the man would go ahead and find the next survey mark, and then he'd wave the others to come on. Then somebody'd go and find the next one. I suppose they were maybe a quarter of a mile, half a mile apart. So he got to the colonel, and he said he wanted land, and the colonel said, how old are you? And he said, I'm 19. He says, you can't have it. And but young Garrett Oakes said, so I'm all alone in the world, and please, I'd like some land. And the colonel says, well, you have any money to pay the fee of $50 and hire assistants to do your settlement duties? And Oakes said, well, I can pay the fee. He must have had some money in that family. And he said, my own hands, I'll do the settlement duties. So Talbot gave him his property, which is approximately now on the site of New Sarah. And he was a very successful settler and had a lot to do with Talbot and always spoke very highly of him. But and he, of course, would have spoken through that window, as would Abraham House, who also got a lot that day.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. But that's it. That's an interesting way to put it, because most of the early settlers did go to Talbot and made impressions on him. The Pierce family, the Story family, Stephen Backus, who made the first settlement at Tyrconnell, Daniel Rappledge, David Mandeville, who made really the first settlement on the site of St. Thomas, impressed Talbot. And as time went on, they became very important people in the development of the settlement and bringing people in that they knew. So probably made good choices.
One thing about Talbot, certainly he didn't give out the land to any absentee landowners, did he?
No, he was completely against this.
He could have sold a lot of his property to absentee landholders or speculators, and he never did that. I mean, you had to come out and see him, eh?
That's true, yes. In fact, number 2 highway which is the road from Lambeth through to Sarnia, was called the Longwoods Road, and it was a very famous road. But very few people settled on it because of absentee landlords. What Talbot did was to convince the British government and the government of Upper Canada that his method of putting roads through by placing settlers along the road and then reimbursing them with extra property was a very successful one. And in a very short time, he was able to do what many other government officials hadn't been able to do for several years.
Yeah, see, we criticize Talbot here, and you know, we play up his irascibility and everything, but actually, instead of speculating with the land, and he often had to wait years, didn't he, to get his money for the settlement duties. He was fairly good with people, but because he did insist on that road development, this part of Ontario developed extremely rapidly.
Right. He moved land back. He moved the government and church land back from the roads, and then ran the roads directly between points.
Wayne, could you say something about the clergy reserves, and then we can explain how Talbot didn't let that interfere with his settlement?
Right. Well, and when the British took over Upper Canada, which was 1791 or before, they passed an act in 1791 which gave 1/7 of land to Crown and 1/7 of land to the Anglican Church. And the idea being here that as the church and government sold these lands, they would be able to pay for the schools and to maintain the church. It wasn't so much to hang on to property, but to provide monies in place of taxes over the years ahead. This didn't bother Talbot. He took one look at the whole pioneer scene and said, you can't walk 40 miles around a government reserve. You've got to go right through the center. He said, we have to have a road from this point to Long Point, and if we don't, we're not going to bring settlers in. And so oftentimes he circumvented their directions, and in the number 4 highway, which comes from Lambeth to Talbotville and to St. Thomas, was supposed to come from Lambeth to Talbotville to St. Thomas. But both Burwell and Talbot realized that they needed a road which would go out toward Port Talbot, into Aldborough and through Southwold and Dunwich. So they just simply, when they got to Talbotville, instead of finishing the road, they turned and went back toward Port Talbot.
Did they?
And when the government found out, they were pretty hostile. And if you read the letters, they were prepared to do some pretty ugly things to Talbot and Burwell. They just simply said, well, the war was on, we lost the papers. We thought it was okay.
But I think he was, you know, he's a sort of benevolent despot.
Oh, yeah.
And, you know, despots are despots, but I think he was benevolent, and he had a remarkable capacity, really, to cut through all that red tape that prevented other settlements growing as rapidly as this.
Yes.
And if you were to, at that time, I suppose, to have been up in an airplane or a balloon and looking down on the Talbot settlement, you'd see a road, and there would be houses all the way along that road. That's where the farms were.
That's correct.
Whereas what the government had intended was put a big block of clergy reserves and say, now someday we'll sell this and we'll use the money for churches and schools.
Yeah. George, I think it'd be a good time to use that map, because this illustrates exactly what you're pointing out now.
You think we can? Yeah, I hope we can.
Maybe we could even hold it up for the camera.
Yes, we can hold that up. I think they can get a camera on that. There we are. Now our faces are out of it, and it's there. Now, do you want to talk about that?
This is Lake Erie down below,
Yeah.
And I'll put the ruler back.
I'm going to hold it.
Okay. And this is Kettle Creek running down here, and its tributaries coming in. So what we're looking at is an 1814 map of Yarmouth Township. And this straight line here was the Talbot Road, which is now Talbot Street. And this is Catfish Creek. So here's Catfish, and here's Kettle. So this is Talbot Road coming over Kettle Creek, and this is where the railroad bridge is today. And if you look along here, you'll see that Colonel Talbot was able to place settlers on almost every lot along the road between what is St. Thomas and New Sarum, and past New Sarum almost to Elmer by 1814. And if you go through and you look at some of these names, you'll find Daniel Rapolje, Jonas Barnes. You've heard of Barnes Street. You find Joseph Mann, Garrett Smith from Lyndhurst, and the person you were talking about, Garrett Oakes, is down here, and so on. But these were all important settlers, and they were all placed along the road very quickly, and that road was open and became one of the best roads in North America.
Yeah. I just remind our audience that is an 1814 map, and this area here is the St. Thomas of the present day, isn't it?
Yeah, right, right.
And but surely you can see the pattern there of by making the road straight and putting the lots on either side. There's hardly anybody in these other lots. Down at Port Stanley, there are 3 lots of Bostwick, and now you say he was an absentee landowner at that time.
And then he settled there, and really he's the founder of Port Stanley,
Yes,
eventually.
but, he had the lots a long time before he settled.
Yeah, right. And these are some of the clergy and crown reserves. You can see them out here. And this land was owned by a Colonel Bobby from Windsor, who again was on the land board in Windsor and was able to get a hold of the property. Let's move along a little bit, George, and then we can come back to...
All right.
If we can look at a couple more slides now.
There you are, it's on that one there.
Okay. This is the little church at Tyrconnell, St. Peter's, and this is where Talbot really had his first settlers. This was the Pierce families and Stories, Bacchus, and they were all related people. They came from Pennsylvania. Talbot thought a great deal of them, treated them kindly. They started a settlement. Within a very short time, Tyrconnell became an important port, and this is also where Talbot is buried, at least across the road.
Yes, that was the second church in Elgin County, wasn't it, really? The old church in St. Thomas was first, and Talbot contributed to that, and then I think Mrs. Story, wasn't it, who gave the land for that
property.
church? Yeah.
Yes, right. This is the plaque which you see at the bottom of the St. Thomas Hill, bottom of the Fingal Hill, and it tells about the first Talbot Road. And while we're going to say something about the man who, next to Colonel Talbot, was responsible for it. And again, all of these roads were, I think you have to give credit to Talbot and to this gentleman we're going to say something about in a minute, Malin Burwell. Now, it's difficult to see all the roads, but they basically are Highway number 3 and Highway number 2 and Highway number 4. And then Warncliffe Road and Commissioner's Road were put in at the time. And in a way, indirectly, Talbot was responsible, but these are other people, like Simon Westbrook, or Simon Watson. Colonel Burwell, Talbot's right-hand man. You want me to say a few things about him?
Yes, I think so. You're
right.
an
Well,
expert
as you
on
know,
Burwell.
I'm fascinated by Colonel Burwell because he didn't get very much credit for what he did, and I have a feeling that a lot of it was personality, and he bet on the wrong horse politically, and he was the bad guy. He did the dirty work when it had to be done.
Like
And,
building that road against the government instructions, you mean?
Exactly, and I think he might have enjoyed that sort of thing. He was a colonel in the War of 1812. He was captured by American troops, came back, became the sheriff of London District, which included Middlesex and Elgin counties now, and more. He was the member of Parliament. He was Justice of the Peace. He was the head of the First Masonic Order.
What year was that first Masonic Lodge here that he was the head of?
That was it was just it was around 1818.
1818.
Yeah. Now that may be off a year, but what I'm relating it to was the death of Daniel Rappelgee. And Daniel Rappelgee's son was made a member of the Masonic just before he died, and I've seen the document where he had just paid his fees and then died shortly after.
We usually think of a thing like Masonic Lodge as coming into a territory after it's been more settled. I'm surprised that Masonic lodges that early in St. Thomas.
Well, actually, maybe I shouldn't say that's not being a member of the order and you being a member of the order, but it was a rather illegal kind of group.
Oh.
There were 30 Masonic groups in Upper Canada, and none of them was recognized by the main branch in the United States.
Oh, I see.
But nevertheless, they carried on, and Burwell actually performed the burial service and some marriage ceremonies. Let's go on a little bit.
Yeah.
Have another slide. If you stand at the Iona Road and look back toward Fingal and hence towards St. Thomas, you're looking back the Talbot Road, the very first parts that were laid out by Colonel Burwell. Now, just where we were taking the picture from is where Colonel Burwell had his farm and his main office, the registry office of the county, and this is where his wife and their several children lived, and where he directed most of his surveys from and his energy for many years. There's no longer a building there, and no Burwells own the property, but he did leave one bit to posterity, being the old neutral earthworks. And he was very interested in history, and particularly local history, and so he left the South Walled earthworks, which was a part of his farm, to perpetuity. So
Now, can I just interrupt you?
Sure.
That's absolutely right, is it? That the Southwold Earthworks, which most people in St. Thomas might have got out to see, was part of the Burwell farm, and it was he who insisted that it be not plowed over and so on, as
Exactly.
it might very well have been. Eh?
Right, right. And there is some concern, I think it's justified, by people that live out there, that in the event that federal government officials and archaeologists would do work there, that there may be some infringement on local farmers' rights. Now, that won't be the case. There has been some work done in the last year or two, which is great, but they'll do everything possible not to step on anybody's toes or to get to try to take any land away from people that should have it. Now, this next slide is the monument that's left to the Burwell site. There's nothing else.
I might say to the people who are looking, can we get that site on again?
Yeah,
It strikes me as funny. It looks like a big marker, but actually it's about a foot high altogether, isn't it?
Yes, it's not very large.
And it's hidden in the long grass, and you really have to look for it at the junction of those two roads you mentioned. And really, it'd be a place where we should have one of those historical markers, such as we have for Rappelge in front of the City Hall and for Duncombe by the museum and so on.
Yeah,
rather than that little stone, because anybody drives by it and they don't even see it.
That's correct. If anybody deserves some recognition.
Well, you've got me convinced that Burwell is a very important man. I think he is.
Okay, now if we let's move along the Talbot Road then through to what is St. Thomas, and
You have another picture. Do you want?
well, I'd rather
you wanna
leave that
hold
for a
All
minute
right,
since I
all
noticed
right,
it was
yeah.
backwards. That's my fault too.
Oh,
Can we have a look at this sketch?
and all right.
Okay.
You're on there now, Wayne. You want to talk about
Right.
that?
Yeah, the story behind the sketch is that it was an oil painting done by the Airy, the Julius Airy, nephew of Colonel Talbot. And the actual sketch looks more toward what is St. Thomas. But so it's just, the point I took was from over by where the Penn Central or Conrail Bridge goes up to old Captain Drake's home and property. And this drawing was made, and this painting was made around 1840, but it shows St. Thomas much the way it was from early Rappelge time, 1830, the time you were talking about, just a little bit after, through the War of 1812, down to the Reform period. And you can see these buildings at the bottom of the hill. This was a famous store, Hamilton Warren, and Mr. Hamilton became a very important sheriff in the London district later. This would be the Mandeville home, and you've heard of Mandeville Road, of course. That was David Mandeville, who came with Daniel Rappelge. This was a hotel. It might have been Mandeville's, or it was called Keeley's, and it was called several other names. Yeah. It's hard to put a finger on it. But the road from London came in, just as it does now, but did not go through Sunset Drive. Instead, you had to go up the hill and past what would be the old museum now, and then down Port Stanley Street, or Stanley Street now, and around the hill and on to Port Stanley.
Wayne, I live on Stanley
And so you
Street,
live there.
and all of the people now are using it as a speedway and a shortcut into St. Thomas, and the traffic just horrendous on Stanley Street. But that was the old historic road from London to go up the hill and down Stanley Street and then down the other hill, and that avoided building two bridges over Kettle Creek in the valley. Eh?
Right. Now, the sketch map here, which is not the easiest to read.
No, that's going to be hard.
That's going to be difficult. So does it have any
You go ahead.
Yeah.
They've got it on the screen there now, yes.
All right, well, this is difficult. I will try to, here's Kettle Creek, winding down around, and this is Talbot Road coming in from Fingal and up the hill. Now, the reason we're showing this is to show you roughly where Daniel Rapelje, who was the first settler of St. Thomas, had his mills. And it was very important at a crossroads of a creek and a road that a little settlement had a mill. And Daniel Rapelje built his first mill just down below Spawn's Flats. So what I'm pointing at now would be Spawn's Flats. And in the spring, when there's snow down in the valley, you can still see the rut of the old mill race that was dug by hand by people who helped out. And then when they found that wasn't going to work, then they built a larger mill here. And then when they found that still wasn't going to satisfy the needs of early St. Thomas, or Kettle Creek Village as it was called, then they built a much larger mill, which is about where the sewerage plant is in St. Thomas now. This area became known as Hogg's Hollow, and a later mill was, I think, Blackwood's Mill, wasn't it, George? So that this area here then did belong to Daniel Rapelje, and you had that little settlement at the bottom of the hill, which we saw in this sketch. And again, Rapelje was at the top, and he gave one of his lots to his son-in-law, and there was a store on the top of the hill, as well as a store on the bottom of the hill. So there was some competition.
Yes, now the son-in-law who he gave the store to, I think in 1818, he gave a chunk of his property at the top of the hill. That is Pleasant Street, isn't it?
Yeah,
I think.
right.
And that was Horace Foster.
Yes.
Now, you see, Geronimus Rapelje says that was the first store, doesn't he?
Yeah, right.
And who do you believe? Geronimus Rapelje in his journal, says that was the first store.
That was the first store.
And yet we've always kind of felt that Hamilton Warren, that the store down at the junction of the road to London and the road to the Talbot estate
was the first store.
road.
Right.
There's a lot of work still to be done, I think.
Yes, sure. And it's a matter of getting documents together, and this kind of work that you've been doing helps. And if people can, if you can latch onto a name and you find another name somewhere and there's dates involved, then you can put two and two together.
See, sometimes I've thought of Rapelje as being kind of stupid for taking the lot he did, because all that hillside along Stanley Street, and the only flat land was where the church is, up to Talbot Street. And of course he gave that property to the church. But what he was interested in, I suppose, was the mill site.
I think he was a businessman. And I think he was looking for retirement. And it's difficult to judge Rapelje. He was a very fine citizen and a leader. And both he and his son fought in the War of 1812. They were leaders in the community, and anybody that was the millwright, that had the millwright, was a leader. But he died so young.
Yes, he did, didn't he?
Yeah.
But he'd already sold the property there and had bought another lot out, what, east of town?
Yeah, roughly what would have been Old Yarmouth Heights.
Oh, yes.
And his property was divided by him into these several lots, 25, I think, and with the idea being that he would sell them and retire when he got the money. The mill, called affectionately the New England Mills after back home, was also sold to Horace Foster. And Daniel Rapelje, I think, was just tired.
Yes.
And they had moved, and then he died shortly after, and his wife lived for a long time. And Rapelje was an important name in St. Thomas for a long time.
Yes, and there's still a lot of Rapeljes here, aren't there?
Right, sure.
Family still here. So that Rapelje then really, with that first lot in Yarmouth, with the first lot, developed the mill and then gave property to the English church.
That's correct, yes.
And property to the Masonic Lodge, and sold a property to Horace Foster for the first store, and then divided up into building lots, which are the old part of St. Thomas now, on Walnut Street and Center Street to Stanley.
Right, that's exactly the area.
Yeah.
I did have a map of it.
Did you want to... oh, yeah, have we got that? I think the people might like to see that bigger scale map.
This,
all right.
This one here or this one?
Whichever. Let's take that one first.
Yeah,
and then
okay.
this one. Wayne's got so much material here.
This usually takes a year to go through.
Now, if one of the cameras could pick this up, this is a bigger scale map of the... and I'll let you go ahead, Wayne, and you can point out which these are.
Okay, well, it's as you say, it's a bigger scale map of the hill. This is the St. Thomas West End, and the area you're talking about was right in here. And that was Old St. Thomas. But we're looking at what is all of St. Thomas, and these were farms. There are 200-acre farms that were given by Colonel Talbot to people such as Captain Drake. And if you know where the Conrail Bridge crosses the valley, and the top, that's Drake's Hill, and that's where Captain Drake had his property. Then you had David Mandeville south of that. A good guiding line is where the museum is now. That was the old township line.
Oh, that was the township
That was
line.
the township line, and David Mandeville was at the bottom of the hill, right under the railway bridge. And then Daniel Rappelgee was up on the clearing. His first cabin was a little bit south of Mansion Towers, but roughly that was his farm area.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Now, as you go toward the east, you had Garrett Smith, who owned most of Lyndhurst. Thomas Curtis. You've heard the name Curtis Street.
Yes.
Later, it was bought by George Scott. Again, the same name was given. You had the Lawrence Farm here. That's an old St. Thomas name. Samuel Thompson, who was a very famous United Empire loyalist. His little hat shop on the corner of his property was about where the old East End Bank of Montreal was. It's now where the curve in Ross Street and
Yeah,
Flora
I'm never
Street
going to
is.
forgive the city for letting that Bank of Montreal be taken down, but however, we may have to. Okay. What about these other lots?
And then Miller and Mann Farms here.
Is this where
developed in-
Millersburg got its name
That
from?
developed into a little place called Millersburg, which was taken into the city before incorporation. Right. So that was a little village later. And there was another little village out here, too. Then coming back, well, I'll start over here. Then you had Rappelgee.
Yeah.
And then you've got Stanley Street. And then you got Benjamin Drake. And he bought this property, or got this property from a man named Abner Decoux. I've been trying to trace that story,
Yeah,
but I can't
that's,
get it. But he was the one who had the property of where the courthouse stands and so
Yeah,
on,
yeah.
and that was sold to the
Yeah.
county.
Yes, and he also sold the land for Wellington Street School.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And Archibald McNeil, and he was a blacksmith, and he didn't have that much time for farming, so that some of his property was given to the Catholic Church. And then you had Barnes, Wilson, Pierce, and again, these are all old St. Thomas names, and that roughly was what is now St.
Yeah.
Thomas.
Now, if we got time, I think we've got time to show one more. This is an early map of the West End district. Now, do you want to just tell people where we are here?
Sure, okay. Again, if you know where Mansion Towers and Townhouse Towers apartments are, they are roughly right in this area of Stanley and what is the old Talbot Street Hill. Can you see that okay?
Yes.
And this was the hotel area then, as it was for a while in St. Thomas, just in the last 2 decades. It had places like Hutchison House, Bates Hotel, Mansion House, and so on, and other hotels along the way. Then as you go down Talbot Street Hill and past the museum, then you're talking about the old Talbot Road, and then down the hill, you're going past what was Daniel Rappelgee's site originally. And then you have these lots divided up, and you have Dr. Duncombe, who was a famous St. Thomas citizen involved in the rebellion. You've got Mark Burnham's house, and he was the rector of the old St. Thomas Church. You've got Edward Ermitinger's home, and that is now the home of Mr. Barry. He was a very important and very forthcoming and forthright St. Thomas citizen.
Yes.
And then you had a military barracks between King Street and Church Street right here. You had the famous King's Arms Hotel on the corner. You had the Shaw and Goodhue store and post office over here, and several homes and stores along the hill. They even had to be supported by rods behind.
Yes, yes.
But they've all gone, and it's
Yep.
hard to have a key to them. So that was basically your first St. Thomas, at least down to about 1840.
When you point out Edgar Ermitinger's house, which is the present house that Vince Barry lives in, when Ermitinger came here in 1830, he said there were only about 20, 30 families here, I think, in St. Thomas.
Yeah, it was around, well,
And that was just on the brow of the hill all this
Yeah.
way. All of this part where the church is now and Stanley Street really didn't have too many houses or anything on it, did they? No.
not really. That 1837 sketch,
Yeah.
there was also accompanied by a visit by Anna Jameson to St. Thomas, and I think she said there were 300 people,
300.
and it had, or 700, and it had doubled in the last 2 years, so that it might have been about 300 about that time.
Can I ask you one question? You know, I think you have a theory about Rapelje and Mandeville and these people who settled down in, which county were they in first? Norfolk?
Yeah, right.
And
long
then they packed up stakes there and came and settled here. Why do you feel they, left farms they had and had developed? Because they were both middle-aged when they came here, weren't they?
Yeah.
And then they came here and settled in the Talbot estate. Now, why?
Well, I haven't got much of a theory, but I know that Colonel Burwell did recruit people to work on the road. And I have an idea that they may have been looking for something new and different. And they made an application for a lot on that road in 1809 when Talbot sent the application in to make the road. So I'm sure they looked in the future and thought about a village starting there or it being valuable property, and then this would follow through with him selling his property lots. But anyhow, almost as soon as the plan went in for the road, before it was blazed, they had put in their order for 2 lots.
Yeah, because I think in that part I read about Garrett Smith, he mentions them both. And the road hadn't been made yet, but the blaze had been done. So what you're saying is that Rapelje and Mandeville were kind of smart businessmen who looked ahead, who had no roads in their own area where they were, and who said, here's a man who's laying out a road all the way down to Rondeau,
right,
the present 3 highway, and if we get property there and a mill site, then it sounds reasonable. It's always bothered me why, maybe because I'm lazy myself, why someone would pioneer and develop a farm in one area, and then all of a sudden they pull up stakes and go somewhere else.
That's
Although
right.
this happened in the States.
Well, I think too often we have the idea that the pioneers built the home and settled down, stayed all their life. They didn't.
No.
They built it and they sold it.
Yeah.
And then they went someplace else and built it and sold, and eventually they came out of it with a little bit of money.
That's interesting. That seems, I think you have a reasonable explanation of why they came. You'd think you'd get so tired of pioneer life that you wouldn't want to. We have a few minutes left. Perhaps should we say something about pioneer life a little bit?
Well, I think, all right, I think that's a good idea. You had last year a pretty good example of what it was like to live in a pioneer environment when all the hydro went out.
Yes.
And if that had been the middle of January, it would have been a much better example. But these people went to bed with setting down of the sun. They got up in the morning when it came up. They weren't just interested in sex and booze and working hard. They were interested in a good life. They wanted their children educated, and particularly in our county and our area, they went to great lengths to have their children educated. They worked hard, and I think they appreciated somebody like Talbot in the beginning. And remember, we had a very large developing Methodist group here, and they were constantly opposed to the drinking and the carrying on of politics and people. And I think they set up goals of the Puritan ethic. Let's work hard, let's do the best we can with the land, and let's live with the very simple things. And actually, I think maybe they were pretty well off. They didn't have the worries that we have, and they had a pretty good standard of living.
I like your idea about they went to bed with the sun and got up with it, which electricity's made our life a little artificial, and yet they often had all-night parties, didn't they? When they had a wedding or something and they had a family party, they danced all night.
They danced all night.
Garrett Oakes describes one of those where the dancing went on all night and serve a supper and so on. Right. Now, you also mentioned booze. You made an interesting comment there. Was there a lot of drinking in pioneer times? We think of our pioneers as being such great men.
And I think they made the modern tippler, or the modern boozer, look like a tippler, George. They had fantastic quantities of booze, and there was always one distillery, at least 2 in a small place like St. Thomas, and it was easy to get a gallon of good rye whiskey, and there wasn't much beer.
No.
And there wasn't refrigeration, but there was wine.
Yeah.
And people got bored.
Yeah.
And when there wasn't much to do, and particularly when you did get into town or during an election, it flowed freely. You could go to the hotel and you could have a sandwich free, and you could have a couple of drinks for a nickel. and it made life a little bit easier in some
Yes.
respects. And
The
maybe too
early
easy.
papers certainly describe a lot of really sordid, tragic cases of drunkenness.
Oh, sure.
And, drinking yourself to death.
Right.
And I think that's why I liked your statement about the Rappelters and Manvilles who felt, well, this is a good life, we want education, and we want to work hard and make something of
Right.
ourselves.
Well, the typical example of what you're saying is the Pioneer Bee, which started out early in the morning to build somebody a house or barn, which ended up with a big feast and a lot of booze and a lot of fights.
Yes.
And usually they had something concrete at the end of it,
Yeah.
but there was always hard feelings and people feuds and a lot of headaches.
I remember reading in one of the Quaker memoirs of the man made a big point of saying this was the first barn that was put up by a bee that there was no whiskey served at, you know. Wayne, we have a couple of minutes. Is there anything you'd like to say to wind up? And we haven't got as far as we thought we might, but anything else you'd like to say about
Well, no, I think what I would like to say is just a big vote of thanks to you and people like Don Cousins and people in St. Thomas, Don Anderson, who are accumulating historical things and doing a lot of work. And we have had in St. Thomas a lot of really good historians, people like James Coyne and the
yes.
Ermitingers, who have left behind a wealth of material. And what you should do, really, you don't have to have been born in a city to love it. But the more you appreciate your town, the more you read about it, the more you find out about it, the more you read about the people who are involved and so on, I think the better life you have.
Yes.
And so we owe a lot of these historians a big debt of credit.
Wayne, I'm going to have to wind this up. Thanks very much for that plug. I'd also just like to close that Wayne is the author of The Story of the Talbot Settlement, which is available at our bookstores. Wayne, I'd like to thank you very much for
you're welcome.
a very interesting presentation you made. I'd like to remind the viewers that you can see this show tomorrow at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And on behalf of Wayne and myself, I'd like to thank you very much for watching this show tonight. We'll be with you again the second Wednesday in February. Thank you very much, and good night.